me confess, before coming over here, and when Chandrabhanu called me up saying that he is organizing the international conference on narrativizing indigeneity, I was a little perplexed as what to say and how to go about it. Because the second line that he had spoken to me is something to do with the tribes. Having worked with the tribes in India and being an anthropologist by profession, then working in the different corridors in planning, administration, and ministry, I was a little perplexed myself that how this word indigenous group is referred directly to tribes. We should look into this problem from a different angle, purely as an academic aspect, and then see how best we can deal with it. To me, it appears the terms indigeneity and indigenous are the shibboleth, reckoning the groups of people or subaltern societies considering to be below the expectation of certain indices set in the socio-economic levels of their larger society. In the parlance of international organizations operating globally for the development and welfare and empowerment of societies taken to be below the minimum level of living standard and style. Also, such groups of people are known for their distinct culture pattern and hard living conditions in living in somewhat geographical isolation and in far-flung areas. While deliberating upon issues of such societies, space and time, idea of migration and original settlement, genomic movement existed, space and time, reference, etc. are lost sight of thinking that societies have been static and existed with the beginning. This is the whole premise of my argument about how to look at the problem of indigenous people and indigeneity as such. A parallel corollary in Indian context is the usage of the term tribe, rather more specifically the scheduled tribe. There are constitutional provisions for the safeguard of such groups of people, and accordingly to attend their issues and problems, focus was laid keeping some time frame to ameliorate plight and living conditions which somehow continues even today. The idea is when we use the word tribe in Indian context, rather than developmental parlance, it is the welfare, protection, conservation. These things come first to our mind rather than anything else which speaks or smacks of cultural orientation. To begin with, there were some 250 scheduled tribes. But with the policy of inclusion and exclusion, this is a major issue of confrontation and contention, that today we have more than 720 tribes known as scheduled tribes. Look at the number of 250 or 270 in the beginning, around 1950, or with the setting about the first commission, known as the Haber Commission, 270 scheduled tribes were listed. If we take the position that they are the indigenous people, then what has happened to these people who have joined the group later on? So where is the question of indigeneity has gone in? We need to see this. To me, it appears in the global parlance and international welfare and development-oriented institutions and organizations, indigeneity is a concept assigned to reckon the people belonging to the category of deprived, socially discriminated, and haves or have-nots. As a matter of fact, it is a pampered child of the think tank of United Nations Development Program. The idea was conceived nearly 4 decades ago from now, when the necessity to undertake a comprehensive study of the problem of discrimination against indigenous population was felt. The then Subcommission on the Promotion of Protection of Minorities, presently known as Subcommission on Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, now paradigm shift you can see here, was desired to carry out such studies. This followed formation of a working group of indigenous population in 1982. So we see this idea of indigenous people is not very old to stay in the field of academics and development administration. With attention given to the concept, a permanent forum on indigenous issues has been in place only since 2002. The efforts made by the United Nations Development Programme were focused on the mandate covering social and economic, environment, development, education, health, human rights affecting indigenous people's sustainable development. This further was strengthened by the Convention of the International Labour Organization, the ILO, even earlier to this in the late 80s of the previous century, in terms that indigenous people have right to decide their own priorities for development and to exercise control over and participate in development process. Since 1992, when the United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development, or better called as Earth Summit, was held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, issues of rights of indigenous people got further strength in their favor, especially about their values, territory, traditional knowledge, wisdom, and above all, subsistence and sustainable development rights all over the world. Matter of their resource control and management and respecting their territories and cultural milieu was greatly recognized and appreciated. It is the international scene I'm talking. Now these organizations like UNDP, while addressing this issue of indigenous people and indigeneity, addressing the issue to the government of India for taking up such material, such aspects and such focus for their plight and their development, they are using the word very carefully with reference to India, that issue pertaining to highland, tribals and indigenous people. That means there are three categories they understand in India, they persist and they exist. Not only indigenous, to whom directly we can relate to tribes as such. However, coming back to Indian context, we understand in India, concept of indigenous people has been viewed little differently in the wake of theories propagated about and followed convincingly about migration route and chart. As per one write-up put up in anthropological conference at the national level, it mentioned India has served as a major corridor for the dispersal of modern humans by the Middle Paleolithic period, that is 50,000 years to 20,000 years before present. Human appears to have spread to many parts of India. Contemporary ethnic India is a land of enormous genetic, cultural and linguistic diversity. The people of India are culturally stratified as tribal and non-tribal. The people living in forest, remote and far-flung areas having their own culture and practices were recognized as tribe and were given names like Vanvasi, Adivasi, Girijan, etc. Constitution of India has made provision for this kind of people for their protection, care and empowerment by enacting as many as 16 such provisions exist in Constitution of India. So this is basically referring to scheduled tribes with a view to take them for poverty alleviation, remove the backwardness and things of that kind, to bring out those people to the main cultural stream as we know it. Often hurriedly, some tribes have been called to be even autochthones by anthropologists. Yet a recent DNA-based study done by Genetic proclaims is at least 5 genetic pools that intermingle with this. There are 5 racial movements have been shown that they have settled in. Now the question comes, who are the indigenous, whom we will refer as indigenous? To my mind it appears, and perhaps it's logical to say so, let us not limit the concept of indigeneity and indigenous people only to tribe. We are an academic institution, we are a research institution, we have people as our focus and mandate to understand their culture and history and things of the kind. There is no harm in concentrating are pooling more resources to collect the material or document the material of that culture which seems to be distinct and which is rather on the verge of being extinct or in the wake of present day changes that we are suffering from. Now, scheduled tribe have been understood in terms of the constitutional provision with the 5 conditions. And it is very interesting to say that we have not limited the number there. There is constitutional provision as well with the policy of inclusion and exclusion. With that, what is happening, that even the caste groups are coming into the fold of scheduled tribe. Only when more people come in this whole demanding reservation kind of thing, only few people have been omitted from the list. Now those tribes who have been omitted from the list, what happened to them? Do they cease to be indigenous? Remains a very important question. Now, this aspect gives me a view that let us look at our country, and there are culture centers, culture zones, linguistic zones, on the basis which each zone, each center, each region represents its own distinct culture. If we are narrativizing all these cultures as indigenous, let us collect all those also to be justified in the field of narrativizing indigeneity, so far the India is concerned. I would like to stop my things here, etc., because much tone has been said in the previous inaugural session about this, that how vague the term indigeneity and indigenous are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chandra. What I would like to suggest is that since there's a paucity of time, let us take the questions at the end of all the presentations. Is that okay? Yeah. Is that acceptable? Okay. So we quickly move on to the second presentation by Vinod Agarwal on British colonial colossal blunder, narrativizing indigeneity of the scheduled tribes, now Adivasis in India.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to take so much time, but I will put some salient features of the paper that I briefly prepared for this purpose in a draft format. I would like to say that after the India's independence from yoke of British colonialism, the new rulers of independent India decided to continue to follow almost all rules framed by British imperial power. That's the first blunder that we did. I'm saying we as a citizen of this country, in terms of control, subjugation and suppression of the natives of this country, read here term citizens of this country. Please remember that 2/3 of India was only under the direct control of British, which is what constitutes today India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. British never controlled the entire country. Land-wise, 40% land was not under their control. And therefore, the rules that were framed at that time by the British were not applicable to the entire country. None of the native states of India, which more than 360 plus, applicable those rules were applicable. So, what we are looking at today is a historical blunder first done by the British, repeated by the rulers of this country in 1947 when they were putting the frame constitution. The first time Ghuriye from Bombay University pointed out this mistake. The current debate taken up by several scholars and anthropologists is about such a classification and section of the Indian population as tribes. He said that's a false. It is not correct. But nobody listened to him. And the British went on to tell us that first we were Aborigines, tribal population was Aborigine, then they were scheduled tribes, then they became tribals, and God knows how many more classifications were given. If you read through the census of India 1871 and onward, you will find every census, the British census takers changed the definition. The commissioner decided what should be the definition, and that was used until 1931. Only after 1931 we have no record, but I'm told by our colleagues that 3 years ago it was decided to reclassify, put the caste back into the census data, I don't know how far it has moved, but that's the repetition of the history again for talking about Indian caste system. The British classification of tribe and caste has been incorporated in 3 centuries in the Constitution of India, Article 366(25). And if you read through, you will find all kinds of definition given. But today, if you go to a tribal community, even in Odisha, who are you? We are Adivasis. Now the term Adivasi is a coinage of Mahatma Gandhi and his disciples, and that got into it. And so the scheduled tribes became Adivasi. The term Adivasi comes from the historically those who were the original inhabitants of land, much applicable to Aborigines of Australia, American Indians in North America, but that cannot be applied in the context of India because the scheduled tribes, so-called, and so-called Hindus who are Sanatanis, they lived side by side for time immemorial. If you go through Mahabharata, you go to Ramayana, all the descriptions will tell you that they live together. Even today they live together as they were living, as I will mention to you a little later. It is pertinent to mention that the scheduled tribes and other population in India have been living in an interactive, symbiotic relationship and remain interdependent on each other for a variety of goods and services for time immemorial. This is the key issue that I am making, that they were never a separate entity. Even today, you go to any place. I was coming through this place on both sides of the villages. There were shops selling, buying, and who are buying, tribals are buying and selling their things. So that's a very important point that should be done. I documented this way back in 1977 when S.C. Dubey wrote his book on Heritage of India, Tribal Heritage of India. On a broader geographical and political canvas, the same can be said about Bangladesh and Pakistan, or for that matter Myanmar. It is not a process only existed in India. In a whole subcontinent you can see this happening. For example, in Bangladesh, the so-called tribes were recognized as scheduled tribes based on historical association of similar names of scheduled tribes in northeastern region. Bangladesh did not recognize only 1971 when they got their independence, the point came up. So they copied from our textbook, our constitution, and called them. Otherwise they were Tharwad Buddhist. They were followers of Buddhism, and some of them were Christians. It all happened in 1971, I mentioned to you. Now, when you go back to Bangladesh, Pakistan, very interesting. Who is the tribe? Mochi Hindu tribe, Mochi Muslim tribe, Agarwal tribe, and so on and so forth. So every caste names were put on a tribe because South Pathans are the only one who could be in Indian constitution be called scheduled tribes. But they won't recognize and they don't accept it. But for the purpose of classification, they have done it much later. The reason for laboring on this issue is to bring out a historical blunder made by British colonial rulers that is yet to be corrected. It is this reason that the cultural history must be nativatized and indigenized to correct the cultural perspective of South Asia and India specifically. The term narrative, I have a difficulty in pronouncing the word, but I'll try. Narrativizing has no dictionary meaning per se, but it meant to reflect, understand, and portray those who themselves who are being discussed, described, and interpreted by others. The others here were the British. So the people from the community did not ever describe themselves, and therefore what happened is what we are suffering today. Recently, a national conference to narrativizing literary expression in Northeast region of India was held in September 2013 at Aizawl. Several authors presented their work to discuss the degree to which indigenized perspective was reflected in the literature largely written by North Asian region. This is the first attempt that I saw anywhere in the country that was done. The question today in the conference raised is whether narrativizing indigeneity is possible to the British colonial concept like tribe, social group, ethnic group, like Bhils of Dhar. I had worked among the Dhar tribe many years ago. I continue to go, so I took this example. Is it possible to narrativize indigeneity tribe in its colonial content, an essence that was later dropped and incorporated in the Constitution of India as scheduled tribes? At the same time, narrativizing indigeneity for the true reflection of such social groups after independence in the Indian civilization, popularly referred to as mainstream, has been extremely complex and difficult. Nobody has done so far, so we are still suffering from it. Given the varied condition under which the scheduled tribes live in different parts of country and different languages and distinct cultures they speak, Mukherjee historians, and they have also recognized this mistake. And in the history of India, they pointed out this very clearly. It is a mistake. Therefore, I raise the question, should a similar question be raised about whole of India and all scheduled tribes of India, not just only in Odisha? Observations and large number of field researchers support the view that scheduled tribes, in spite of their remote living, continue to interact with the rest of the neighboring Hindu caste and other religious groups for time immemorial. Notwithstanding the controversy, it is suffice to say that Constitution of India in Article 330 has recognized scheduled tribes as a separate social category who are considered socially, economically and technologically deprived group. I watched the Serva dance here. If you come to Gujarat and you watch the women on Navratri time, they will be dancing exactly like that, with different kind of attire, different singing, but the musical tone might be similar. What I'm trying to say that this artificial separation, creation of alien rulers have killed us in more than one way, even today, and we are suffering from that. After lapse of more than 200 years that has witnessed major economic, political and social technological methods of governance of India, in which time frame should one consider for describing and narrativizing indigeneity? Can principles incorporated in the Constitution of India and enunciating provisions of reservation of seats in central state and union territory, apart from reservation in education and jobs, other facility to uplift and bring scheduled tribes in the mainstream should be examined. I am asking a simple question because we have to find other ways and means that is working for us. So I leave this part and only come to simply two lines at the end, that exceptions apart, India and exceptions apart, you can see this process across the country, and there are which are distributed in more than one state, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat and other states, Rajasthan. And how do we deal with them? For the purpose of division or partition of the states, they speak different languages? No, they speak tribal languages, if you use the term and scheduled tribe. So what is the thought for action today? And I'll spend a few lines and then stop it. The brief profile of household that I studied in the state of Gujarat very recently indicates that we cannot talk, if we have to talk in digital terms, tribes and non-tribes. The rest of the country should be non-tribes and not talk in terms of Hindu and tribes. That's the first point I'm trying to make. The second point that I want to indicate that there is a need for some other method to be followed for narrativizing indigeneity. The method suggested should be drawn from the linguistic structures, what has been referred to as an emic approach to anthropological literature. We have to look in linguistic terms and not look in any other term. It calls for a fresh national linguistic survey of the country, which was done at the end of the 19th century, that too by British colonial administrators, to serve their limited purpose of control and revenue collection. In the recent past, it has been partially attempted. National Linguistic Survey, to my mind, will throw a large number of emic categories that can be helpful to redraw new social and identifiable communities, boundaries, and their linguistic regions. It will also help correct existing distortions inherent in the earlier ethnographic analysis of the Indian civilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Agarwal. We have the third speaker now, Dr. Satyanarayan Ratha, who was former professor at Sambalpur University, and he will talk to us on the indigenous issue in the Indian context.
I have to make only 2-3 simple points. I won't take much of your time. Number one is that the modern human beings, the biologists call them Homo sapiens, is single in source. Years back, this was the proposition of Darwin, and Darwin pointed out to Africa as the epicenter of human evolution. And only in 2010, the mitochondrial DNA research has established that East Africa is the source of the present modern human beings. And this happened some 200,000 years ago. And the human population moved out of East Africa to the rest of the world, and that happened around 60,000 years ago. If this is taken as a scientific fact, the question of indigeneity is solved. Outside East Africa, every population is non-indigenous. But this happened 60,000 years ago, and by the time the world was exposed, the people have been settled at different parts of the world in situ until they were disturbed by the colonial powers. And this happened around 1000 AD and continued till about the end of the world wars. And during this time, the major players were the European powers, particularly the Dutch, the Spanish, English, and the French. And to a little extent, the Ottoman Empire and the Japanese. So as it stands, the definition of indigeneity is said that people who were there before colonization. This obviously means that all these colonial people who are around the world, other than their own country like Europe, they are non-indigenous. It's very, the question is very simple in Africa, in Brazil, in Canada, in America. It's not so far as India is concerned. So when we come to India, the first European entry into Indian soil was probably Alexander's invasion, sometimes in 400 BC, 326 BC or something like that. And after that, the next entry historically comes to the Arab conquest of Sindh in 712. Then systematic entry of the aliens in the Indian soil starts with Muhammad Ghori and defeat of Prithviraj Chauhan. And then gets culminated in 1757 by British occupying a large part of an Indian territory. Before this happened, a large part of it is covered in your discussion also, before this happened, India was one country and one civilization. If you look at Mahabharata, the entire country has taken part in that war. And what of the language was, the communicating language was then Sanskrit. Otherwise, how could they understand each other? And then, when you come to the Indian scriptures, the Vishnu Purana is one which may be dated to, according to your carbon dating, it is something, but according to our dating, it is more than 5,000 years old. So that says, defines India. Uttarang disi samudrasya himadri saiva dakshinam tadvarsam bharato nama bharati tatra santati. This definition says India is one country and one people. But from the anthropological perspective, in a large geographical area, you have the environmental constraint and small communities grow up within the larger community. The classic example is Nagaland, where every village is different from the other and every village has the tribal dialect in every village different from the other. So the point I am trying to make here is, India is such a vast country, and within this vast cultural whole, small cultures grew up. So I don't believe in this mainstream and the substreams. The whole thing is one stream. Indian culture is one stream, and every community has contributed to it. And the linguistic groups in different parts of the country, the part of this whole stream. And finally, what I try to conclude here is that the Indian population as a whole, before the entry of anybody else, is one in source, and we have indigeneity of a whole and indigenously as parts. So parts in the whole. So Indian population as a whole is indigenous, and within the indigenous we have, they take part in the Khasis. The Khasis should be taken as indigenous to Khasi hills, but at the same time they are also indigenous to India. And if you look at the Koraput situation, Professor Mahanti was talking about, the local population in Koraput call themselves as Desiya, and all others who have come who are non-Desiyas are Gadiyas. The Gadiya is indigenous away down the hills. When he goes up to the hills, he loses indigeneity in the part, but as a whole he is indigenous. The Khasi is indigenous to India, but at the same time also indigenous to Khasi hills. The Assamese cannot claim indigeneity in Khasi hills. So my proposition is that the question of indigeneity in India is to be taken in India as a whole indigenous. We have indigenous parts. Thank you very much.
I have the last presentation of this session by Professor Brian Martin, who's the Deputy Director of Puri Institute of Education in Deakin University, and he'll be talking to us on decolonizing amnesia, refusing false consciousness.
I do have some slides here, and I'm going to just quickly present the 6 papers from Australia that are part of this conference, although I am not 6 people on one person. But I just wanted to give you some background to what I suppose Australia is for me and for a lot of Indigenous people in Australia. This is Aboriginal Australia behind us here. As you can see, there's over 400 different countries in Australia. So it's interesting when we talk about this notion of oneness. I suppose the opposite way, colonisation had created a notion of oneness in Australia when there was all these different Aboriginal nations. In pre-colonial times, there was over 450 different languages. Today, there's 110 languages in use. So about 300 languages are totally lost. They're gone. Some of those languages today are still endangered, but there is a trajectory to try and protect those languages. But I just wanted to give you some background. The age of Aboriginal Australia, when we look at mitochondrial DNA, dates Tasmanian Palawa people from the bottom of Australia at around 400,000 years old. The oldest Homo sapiens sapien was found in New South Wales on Barkindji country at 82,000 years old. The oldest art worker in the Kimberleys is 110,000 years old, and the oldest hominoid skull was found in Tharawal country, New South Wales, at 7.2 million years old. We did not come from Africa. I just want to say that. The papers that are going to be included in the publication from this conference are listed up here. And the first two papers are PhD students, Dee Basaraba, who's looking at something that's prevalent in some of our remote communities, and it's fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So women who drink excessive amounts of alcohol while carrying a child, and the effects that it's had on our communities. But in that, she's exploring how you negotiate relationships in researching Aboriginal communities, even as an Aboriginal researcher. The next paper is Janice Cormatri, who's an elder, Narrativising elder from South Australia, and she's looking at, I suppose, the impact of gambling in our communities, in Victorian Aboriginal communities, and also how she's looking at different ways that health authorities can work with local Aboriginal communities to look at the various strategies in overcoming gambling. Dr. Margaret Kumar, her paper is really about drawing on relevant conceptualizations of what is being, the notion of being, in relation to several theories and disciplines of thought. In that definition, she problematises Indigenous knowledge systems with a review of literature on issues surrounding its use and so on as well. The paper by Professor Liz Cameron looks at a reflection of traditional Aboriginal Australian visual knowledges as being expressions of dialect that communicates cultural meaning and spiritual messages. And the last paper, the second last paper by Greg Lehman, Greg is examining the history of photography in Tasmania. There's a lot of representation of Tasmanian Aboriginal people in photography during the 1800s. It was said late 1800s, the last Tasmanian Aboriginal person was deceased in the late 19th century, which is a fabrication as well. So once again, that false representation and consciousness. By presenting an analysis of amnesia and how it contributes to false consciousness by its threat to consuming real memory itself, I uncover and elaborate the premise of this based on a Western understanding of ideology. Working through this trajectory raises how the imaginary needs to be interpolated in order to present individuals as subjects. This action, which further perpetuates false consciousness, is one that protects the dominant culture and its action to conceal the real. This framework is one that produces the unworthiness of the notion of the other, where the relationship and relationality of otherness perpetuates false consciousness. This paper, therefore, provides an alternative, a situated decolonisation that destabilises the construct of false consciousness. It is through the primacy of practice and practices and the ritual of those practices that articulates the real that needs no interpolation. And by presenting a decolonised situated real, we can reconsider elaborate ways of thinking about the value of lived experience from colonised peoples. Therefore, I argue it is through relationality that we refuse false consciousness. Amnesia here, basically from the writer by the name of Andreas Huyssen provides amnesia as a metaphor for the museum. So, for example, when we look at cultural artefacts that are captured by the museum, and, for example, they're put in archives and they're put in a drawer, they're in fact forgotten. So the premise of the museum perpetuates amnesia. It's a safekeeping of the past, safekeeping of culture, but no one interrelates with those objects anymore. The problem with that, underneath amnesia, is the idea of ideology. And Louis Althusser, I suppose, in a Marxist trajectory, sees ideology. The interesting thing is ideology is defined as our imaginary relationship with existence. So ideology in Western philosophical traditions are based on representation, therefore they're both based on an imaginary relationship to the real world. A Wiradjuri Indigenous writer by the name of Norm Sheehan called this the imaginary moral centre. So everything that the dominant culture produces about the other is based on this notion of morality, on protecting itself. And that imaginary moral centre adds another layer to the constructed false consciousness. He states, what must never be stated is that these identities are not only constructed to marginalise and control First Nations people, they are also constructed to conceal aspects of the dominant culture that may expose it as unworthy. So basically, the answer to, I suppose, this false consciousness is about building relationality. Sean Wilson, Canadian writer, discusses that dominant cultures need to build a deeper understanding of Indigenous people, so that programs, understanding, and I add representations, can grow from the colonialist or paternalistic approach and fully integrate an Indigenous worldview into their philosophies. So drawing on connections, on these type of connections, is interpolation, not interpolation. It's about building relationality. And I was just looking at these two terms in this paper. The term interpolation, from a Marxist standpoint of view, is really about how the movement that individuals, as we said once again, need to be interpolated to have a relationship to existence, which is based on the memory, the imaginary, which is a false representation, where interpolation is about drawing connections between things. It's about building relationality. This is an Indigenous way of doing, an Indigenous way of knowing. If you do not build relationality, nothing exists in a way. So that is generally the argument of this perspective. Now, the moral is simple here. Vision, it's been stated by many writers, especially through feminist theories, vision is better from below. That means the vision from subjugated people. So this is how we can reconfigure notions of ideology as understood by the West, and how we can then reconfigure paternalistic and also colonialist views and representations of Indigenous peoples. Now, the importance, I suppose, in this position is about lived experience. And what I wanted to just quickly show you, because I'm a visual person, I have to show images, is how the visual can talk about lived experience. These are a collection of drawings that are done from the abstract to the representational. So moving from the imaginary, the ephemeral to the concrete to the representation, and back and forth and so on. Each of these images are actually locations of country. So for example, this is Barkindji country, which is in far west New South Wales. These are small panels. These are quite large works. I'm going to flick through this very quickly because I know we don't have much time. So these drawings are constructed and they're built over time. So the whole idea is, as I said before, moving from the notion of the abstract to the representation. I'll move a bit faster. So each panel is about so big. And you'll see, I'll just flick through these works, different locations around Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. And for example, this is Eora country, Darug country in Sydney, Barkindji country, Darug country, Wiradjuri country, that's Wurundjeri country, Darug country, Barkindji, Wiradjuri country, Wurundjeri country, Barkindji. And these last few are actually where my grandmother is from, which is on the borders of Gamilaroi and Bunjalung country in northern New South Wales. So these are the last few. Just put this up here because this is my wife. If I don't show you her, she will kill me. I'm joking. But basically this gives you an idea of the scale, the size, and also this is in a national gallery where you can actually walk on the work, you can experience the notions of country. And it's interesting when we look at representation and abstraction, and this goes to Indigenous representation and abstraction, is when a lot of Aboriginal art historically was done on the ground. It was about viewing the aerial points of view. It's about experience, it's about lived experience. Once you put something on the wall, it becomes representation. It becomes something totally foreign to, I suppose, the Indigenous way of knowing. So I'd leave you with that. So thank you.